just walked in, so
Okay.
he's gonna,
handle the tech side of things.
well, if there's anything that needs to be handled. I know, as soon as I see the mask, I'm like, hi, John. Good.
We was star yesterday. There was no way I could have done. I didn't get home till 2 a.m.
Last
An hour and a
night,
half to wait for our lunch. Lunch just never came out.
oh
It was the
no.
worst. I've had that one. It was bad. It was bad.
Okay, that's really frustrating.
So half the luggage came out, and then we were online to claim for the second piece. And it finally, do you want me to put a mask on? Okay.
Okay. I know, I walked in and I said, I'm not sure what the mask situation is. So when is she coming? She said, you know, she knows it's not gonna come, it's gonna be at noon, so we're doing crap. My guess is she'll be here shortly. I'll look at my phone. I can't move it for last Friday.
Monday and Friday before. So we're there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. What else do you do?
Where were you?
The Feldman Bar Mitzvah. So yesterday I didn't come because when I was at the Feldman Bar Mitzvah.
Oh, I can imagine, like, no, we didn't, we literally, we had crappy weather the first day, but we just, you know, walks, I can't do more walks.
Okay.
And,
2 more minutes. 5 minutes, okay. Maybe we'll start in 5 minutes.
Okay, that's fine.
I do know that.
yeah, Pam, all the days.
Yeah.
Wild Sunday last month. June's in.
Well, it's the first time I had lunch there. They take their mask off.
It's just beautiful.
Right.
We had been there
So,
many years
as much
ago.
as-
We have friends in Scottsdale, so we drove 2
Yeah,
hours.
what's the,
from Wine
are you getting the
to go
4
to
dose
Durham,
booster?
Even at their new home.
I'm
for
probably
3 hours.
gonna wait either until the
But I
fall
wanted to see them.
or we're thinking of traveling this summer or until right for a
But I
time.
wanted to see their new home.
But my in-laws will probably, my in-laws will be ready.
Well, it's funny, because I just read the actual CDC requirement, or not recommendation, from Michelle Walensky.
But it was very,
But it said if you were 50 and older with underlying conditions. If you're 65 and up, it's not complicated. And
And in
everybody's.
fact, a lot of other countries have apparently said for older people, it's recommended for older people. That's why I recommend for in-laws. For me, like I said, I think in the fall, because it gets to make up in the fall, like, it'd be like your, my guess is, I'm wondering, it's like a flu shot, like every fall. Flu shot. And they may start to buy it.
Which would be very smart. And get a higher efficacy rate.
So I suspect that, like probably in September, I'll go get my flu shot. And
I've been there before many years ago.
because cases, you know, because soon everything's gonna open up, windows will be open, people will be outside.
Exactly.
It'll be a lot different.
It'll be easier, yeah. Are they keeping windows open in the cafeteria or not?
They are, they open windows as much as possible. The problem is it's been kind of cold, right? So you open windows.
Exactly.
But like soon it'll start warming up.
We keep saying that, and then it's 4 degrees.
We're supposed to go to Washington DC, we're actually doing the DC trip this year for the first time in 3 years.
Oh,
Unfortunately, it's supposed to rain.
oh, jeez Louise.
So I don't know how we're gonna handle that. That's gonna be really,
Oh.
we're gonna be on the bus.
And the bus.
And the bus.
Oh.
I'll be wearing a mask on the bus all the
Okay.
way down.
All right, we're gonna start. Perfect. So, okay, hello. Hi.
I have prepared remarks, but given that we're all friends, I'll just start the program. So I think, as everyone knows, this is part of Mitzvah Day, part of the Metro West effort to do good deeds on April 3rd. And we are going to have a program here with David Korfage, who is with the Montclair Climate Action. And you're just going to, and has been very involved in climate change and addressing it for many years, lives here in Montclair, teaches at Montclair Kimberly Academy, lives here with his wife and 2 children.
Yeah, actually, my 2 children are off in college now, so now it's just us.
So we really
smiling.
All right, so we really appreciate your time and we really appreciate your efforts on this particular issue.
Well,
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to stand because I have notes here which I need to look at. So, but I hope to keep this pretty informal. Thank you for being here and taking time to find out a little bit more about climate change and what you can do, what we all should be doing to address it. So before I start, as already said, I'm a teacher, so I'm going to try something I do as a teacher to get some background and how much you feel like you know, how familiar you are, kind of helpful for me. So I always do this with my students. I want you to hold some fingers. Show how well informed you are. 1 is you don't feel that well informed. 5 is lots of you follow Climate Central and 350 on Twitter. You read the latest book, you can give you 5. And then you say what's a greenhouse gas, you can do 1. So just I'm curious, no right answer. How well informed do you feel on climate change on a scale of 1 to 5?
And 5 is highest?
5 is highest.
3. Oops.
3.
Hold on, fingers.
See some 2s, see some 3s. Okay, so that's helpful to know actually. So. So that's fine. So that's good to know. For some reason, my students, I almost always put up 3. That's
Safe answer.
Put 3. So great. So thank you. Sorry. So when you think about the climate crisis, what comes to mind? What's your reaction? What word comes to mind? How does it make you feel?
Guilty.
Guilty.
Scared.
Scared. Other thoughts?
Confused.
Confused.
Helpless.
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 Paralyzed. So there's a lot of anxiety around this, clearly. And so one of the things we can talk about is what did you say?
5. Sorry.
5. So there's a lot. So one of the good things, I always, when I was active with the group Citizens Climate Lobby, we once walked in the 4th of July parade, and I helped us on said the antidote to action is the antidote to despair. So the way to do stuff is the way to get around that is to become active. And so we encourage people to sort of transmute their fear and anxiety into action, encourage to act, even if you're not sure what the results are going to be. So I'm going to say a little bit about climate change itself, what causes it, what we can expect if we don't do anything, and I'm going to try to say more about what we can do, what we need to do as individuals and as a society to address this problem. So climate change, again, just to be pretty brief about this, we've known about the core science behind literally for centuries. Certain gases, most importantly carbon dioxide, but also methane, trap heat. So it's like putting a blanket. Of course, everyone knows what happens if you put on more and more blankets. You get hotter and hotter. If you ever toss off a blanket in the middle of the night because you're too warm, you know exactly what it's like. That's, of course, what we've been doing to the planet. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, a little over 2 centuries ago, human beings have been burning these fossil fuels, and that's done more and more of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So 200 years ago, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, just to get technical here, was about 218 parts per million. Now, which had been there for thousands of years. Now it's at 280. Now it's 418 parts per million. The last time CO2 levels were this high was about 3 million years ago. And just so you know, last time CO2 levels were this high, there were forests in Antarctica, there were alligators in the Antarctic. Sea levels were 30 or 60 feet higher. So it is concerning. Like I said, the science is well established. It's been known for over a century. At this point, we're just working out the details and, of course, running this gigantic experiment to see what happens if we do this. So you probably know all that. I just want to mention one other thing, which I think is kind of less well known, but to me it's actually a lot more scary, and that's tipping points. So a tipping point is when a large, sudden, and often irreversible change happens in the climate system. So sea levels rise really gradually until an ice sheet collapses and suddenly they go up quickly in the space of a few years. Or the Gulf Stream slowly gets slower until suddenly it stops completely, and Europe gets really cold, there's droughts and crop failures around the world. So this isn't fantasy. We actually have geological records from Greenland, for example, of this happening the past points when temperatures have gone up 10 degrees in a matter of a decade. And the problem is we don't know exactly where these tipping points are, and so we won't know when we've blown past them until it's too late. We won't even know what the first tipping point is. Will it be the Amazon suddenly drying out, or the Gulf Stream suddenly stopping, the Antarctic ice sheets collapsing? We don't know, right? Whatever it is, we don't want to hit it, which is why we should be slamming on the brakes about climate change, right? If you're driving towards a wall, you don't know exactly where it is, you're going to slam on the brakes as soon as you can, rather than seeing how far you can push it.
Can I ask a question?
You may, of course. If you have questions, go ahead. Yes, Audrey.
Has there been a tipping point yet?
We have not hit them yet. The one that's been getting most attention recently is the Gulf Stream. And I actually read one of the more recent climate reports, and it's if you read the reports from this group called the IPCC, which is the UN's body on climate change, it's all very scientific and technical. but if you read between the lines, it was actually, they said, the likely, so when the Gulf Stream stops, that's just that all the heat that gets carried north would be dumped not in Europe, but actually in America, right? So it would change, it would cool down Europe, it would change global circulation patterns and have really dramatic effects, and it could be quite sudden. And the Gulf Stream is indeed slowing down. We have records slow down, so we know it's happening, we just don't know what's going to happen, if and when it's going to stop. The IPC said in their report, basically it's unlikely to happen in the next 100 years, but if it did, it would be really, really bad. So which was not completely comforting, like, oh sure. So we don't know. We haven't hit any of them yet, because we still have rainforest in the Amazon, we still have the Gulf Stream, the Antarctic ice sheets are still there.
We did have an ice shelf that comes in.
We did. So there's been some signs. There's been some signs about like I think it's the West Antarctic ice sheet is starting to break up, and that would it will take centuries for the ice to melt, but it would cause problems. So there's some concerns out there. We haven't hit any of them yet, and I think there's still a chance to not hit them. Right? That's I think why we need to like do something about it. So that's one of the we're going to talk about the effects, and they can be grim, but I also want to say like they're not inevitable yet. Right? There will be things we can do to keep them from happening. So I'm going to actually talk about some of the effects, what's going on already, what's likely to happen, and what could happen. You've probably read about these. They appear in the paper all the time. As human beings, we kind of tend to slip into denial and need to be reminded. And I'll be honest, thinking about these things can sometimes be kind of depressing. It can make you sad. It can make you angry. It can make you feel hopeless. And that's okay. We'll talk about that. It's important to engage your feelings, like I said, to channel them, and sort of move them, be able to channel them in productive directions, to take action rather than just sort of trying to suppress them or just sort of feeling that way. So what are the effects of climate change? I'll speak for a few minutes on that. Most basically, of course, we've seen rising temperatures, right? Temperatures have risen, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, temperatures have risen about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 1.1 degrees Celsius. If we take no action, the temperatures will almost end up 5 degrees higher by the end of the century, and maybe as much as 8 to 10 degrees higher. So currently the average high in Montclair in July is 85 degrees. 10 degrees means the average high would be 95 degrees. So, and that would be the average high, right? So half the time it would be worse, sometimes much worse. That's what we get if we do nothing about it. Already rising temperatures have led to extreme heat waves. You may remember last summer in the Pacific Northwest, there was that huge heat wave across the Pacific Northwest, hit like 120 degrees, totally unprecedented. It's got somewhat less attention in this country, but in Australia in January, they hit temperatures in Australia that had literally never been recorded in the Southern Hemisphere ever. They hit sort of record temperatures in the Southern Hemisphere.
How high?
Around 130, I want to say.
130?
Yeah, the highest temperature in the world is actually in Death Valley. It was like 133. And it wasn't quite that high.
In
but-
Alaska and also in Siberia.
Yes,
They're talking
and-
about incredibly warm weather for those
Right.
areas, yeah.
That's correct, because the Arctic areas are warming much faster than the rest of the planet.
Yeah.
So we don't take action, again, so we don't take action, once a century heat waves will happen every year. So that's like what is now extreme will be normal, and of course the new extremes will be really extreme. They could put millions of lives at risk. There was a book recently, what's it called? The Ministry for the Future, which I'm sure you read. It's about climate change. My wife read it. She said it wasn't a great book. She said I should read the opening chapter because it describes like a heat wave across India that kills like 40 million people. So that's the risk we don't. And again, that's sort of a risk that we don't do anything. So it brings wildfires. You saw wildfires out west. There was burned down the suburb of Denver in the fall. There's been huge wildfires in Australia and so on. You can also expect, and we've seen some of this here in town, we can expect extreme weather, right? More powerful hurricanes, more downpours leading to flooding. Warmer air means more water in the air, and that means more rain. Already extreme storms are common in New Jersey. It's like 75% more likely than it was like 25 years ago or so. We saw this, of course, in the fall with Ida, right? It hit the tri-state area pretty bad. There was a lot of flooding here in Montclair. I know one of my favorite restaurants in town, Mesa, was shut down for months. Mesa. And of course, something like 50 people died around the tri-state area. And New York City hit its record rainfall in August and then broke it again in September. And of course, there's been flooding lots of places. Actually, really bad flooding. I'm sure you've seen the pictures. Really bad flooding in Australia right now. In northern Australia, it's being really badly. But it's been Germany, Italy, China, Mozambique, all around the world.
Yeah, we went to Iceland like 15 years ago, and then we went to an art exhibit, recently of someone who just took pictures of Iceland, and it was amazing, it was so different.
Oh, yeah.
The environment, like some of the glaciers, just, that we have pictures of the exact same picture, looks like a totally different environment.
Yeah.
And it was really stark, it was like, wow, we have that picture, and it's not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great film called Chasing Ice, which they do. They go look at glaciers and they can see how far the glaciers are receding. So again, it's like more droughts, high temperatures leads to decreased crop yields, so we could have which is going to cause problems for food supplies potentially, particularly in the lower income areas, right? The rising temperatures aren't just on land. Actually, a lot of the heat we've been holding actually goes into the oceans, right? So there's actually ocean heat waves. There's been some major ocean heat waves which actually kill wildlife. The thing that's most at risk is actually coral reefs. Has anyone been to see the Great Barrier Reef in Australia? Yeah. I would love to see it, partly because it's actually very endangered. There's been 3 bleaching events in just the past 7 years. Bleaching is when the water gets too warm and the coral starts to die. So there's been 3 bleaching events in the past 7 years. A third of the reef is already dead and it could be gone. In fact, if we do nothing, we were able to snap our fingers and stop greenhouse gas emissions now, still a large share, up to 90% of coral reefs would die. If we don't do anything, they'll all go. They'll just be extinct by the end of the century. And all the wildlife and all the people that depend on them, they're very productive ecosystems, they would also be in trouble. So we've already mentioned the glaciers melting, and that, of course, and the ice sheets, that contributes to sea level rise. New Jersey is actually one of the worst places in the world for sea level rise, this corner of the country, just for a variety of reasons. Already sea levels have risen a foot in New Jersey over the past century. It doesn't seem like much, but that's up.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Well, compared to what's going to come.
Does that include
It does
New York
get
River
inland because
or not?
there's rivers.
Yeah, so this in the northeast area. So like globally, they expect we do anything to get about 3 feet of sea level rise. In this area, could be, the extreme version could be 8 or 9 feet. That's the extreme version, so probably less, probably only, quote unquote, around 6 feet. But it's a lot, yes.
Just for something local, my parents rented a house in Cape May from when I was in high school until they retired. And when they first started renting the house, it was on Cape May Point. There was a road between their house and the beach. Now it's a sand dune. I mean, the water has come up so far that in my lifetime, and I'm not that old, I've seen erosion.
Yeah.
Where there used to be a beach, there are now dolphins swimming.
Yeah. And I've seen like, I've never been to Atlantic City. I've been to the shore, but not to Atlantic City. There's the Atlantic City Expressway. But there's sort of other roads that a lot of sort of locals take to get. A lot of those flood, like in high tide in particular. There's a lot of what's called sunny day flooding, where it's just like, it's a high tide. Just not due to a storm, it's just a high tide. So that's a better, more like Norfolk, Virginia is actually being hit really bad. There's a major naval base there, and they're worried about a hard time accessing the naval base because there's so much flooding there. And this is actually around the world, right? I've seen figures like 2 million people live in areas that are at risk. And not just in major cities, but like subsistence farmers, people on marginal land, Bangladesh is in Montclair. And so that suggests something else is going to happen. If you think about rising sea levels and droughts, you're going to get potentially a lot of climate refugees, people sort of fleeing these effects going to other parts of the world. And of course, part of the problem here from a social justice perspective is that those who are most at risk have actually done all these causes. Most of the greenhouse gases have come from United States and Europe, Japan, and also China. China is actually now a major producer. And of course, the countries that are going to suffer the worst, like the sea islands in the Pacific, for example, or the Maldives, or a lot of countries in Africa. It's like, for example, Mozambique. Mozambique, one of the poorest countries in the world in southern Africa. In 2019, it was hit by 2 mega cyclones within months, and then an extreme drought. That sort of thousands were hit by flooding, tens of thousands, millions were put at risk by drought. And of course, they haven't done anything to cause these problems. It's just being added up to them. So that's what we're looking at if we don't do anything. Temperature increase, heat waves, flooding, wildfires, dying coral reefs, droughts, refugees, and so on. So that's a lot to process. And again, it's probably stuff you haven't heard before. But I always like to pause here and give people a chance to like react, think, share. So I'm just gonna say, just like for 30 seconds, just think, like you've probably heard this stuff before, right? So like it's all in one place. Sort of, what's your reaction? Just think to yourself for a minute or 30 seconds, like what's your reaction? How does it make you feel? What are your thoughts? Just take a minute to like think about all that stuff you hear about or you've read about. What's your reaction to it? So I'm gonna do something I do with my students. You can turn the person next to you. I do this all the time. Turn the person next to you. Just like share your thoughts. Just like, what do you think? What's your reaction? Some thoughts or emotional reactions and thoughts you have. Just turn the person next to you and take a minute to share and your thoughts on this.
If we think, it's important to think of the effects on the world. I agree. It's also affecting areas where, I mean, we used to live in Morris County, which is already a flood.
I think that that's more localized.
So all these areas, floodplain areas.
But they're bad.
They're just refined.
So, you know, when we were driving, we were just driving.
So I think that,
You know, truckers
and then my
don't drag.
Oh, that's interesting, because everyone's changing.
It's not only that, but I know when they.
Yeah, it's incredible.
All right, any reactions, people want to share thoughts,
Yes.
feelings, or questions, or
Right,
things that occur to you?
Sure, they use the
Anything
chains
people
like
share?
double
Yes, okay.
security.
My primary concern, when I think about this, is for my children.
Yes.
I am not at all, I mean, I'm not worried about my generation, but I am very worried for my kids and eventually my grandchildren.
Yep.
It's the future, it's really
Our
the future.
generation caused it, right?
Well,
My daughter always says to me,
well,
when
I
you
feel
guys
better
screw
now
up.
that you tell us that's 200 years in the making.
Although it's interesting, if you look at the greenhouse gases, this is actually really surprising. If you look at the greenhouse gases, almost like half of the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere have been in the past 25 years.
Yeah.
It's a lot to do, actually a lot to do with China, but also the U.S. and Western Europe,
Yeah.
just in general. So yeah, so it's been going on for a long time, but it's really accelerated the past
Yeah,
decade.
okay,
So-
but, you know,
So, and I agree with you. That's actually been a major motivation for me. I'll say later, I got involved because of my kids, right? Because I have two
Yeah.
children, and I wanted to like do something. Say I had done something. Yeah.
no, I'm just thinking that, you know, a lot of times it's hard to wrap your head around what's happening around the world and how it's affecting people, but, you know, how can we shut our eyes? Because it's happening here also. You know, the areas in New Jersey, Morris County, Essex County, Passaic County that are the floodplain is increasing. So, you know, there's a lot of inland flooding. The storms that we've had, my daughter lives in Iowa, they had more tornadoes and this
Yeah.
derecha thing. I mean, you know, all this really weird weather. So it's like, you know, but look at the South. I mean, all of the flooding, the hurricanes. I mean, so this is really affecting us now. I mean, yeah, and then what is it gonna be like in 30 years? Yeah.
Any gardeners out there? Because I've
yeah.
everyone knew Pat Kenshaf, she sort of lived a long time, and she actually talked about how like the growing season is now, it starts like 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah, no, my husband's an avid gardener, he's been.
Yeah, but it was freezing, it was 20 degrees last week.
Yeah, so you get these
It's-
wild
it's-
extreme
it's like
temperatures.
you
It
don't
is,
know-
yeah,
yeah.
it is really extreme.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna add something?
Yeah, I don't know, different subject. What are governments doing about things like sea rise and, you know, like New York City, for example? What, are they doing anything to prepare for it, or are they just gonna deal with it when it happens?
They're doing some things to prepare for it. So, I mean, there was actually an article in today's Metropolitan section of the paper about Jamaica Bay and trying to like do it. And there's a lot of different proposals and they're controversial. Some people say build seawalls, other people say like you can't hold back the rising seas, it's not gonna work. There's been a lot of proposals to use kind of natural, sort of green infrastructure, they call it, sort of marshes to buffer sea level. Actually, they're talking about putting in oyster beds, essentially natural reefs, which will slow down waves. In the long run, to be honest, people are probably gonna have to move, right? And so but that's controversial because then you're like, first of all, it'd be expensive because you have to buy out the houses and move people, and also where they're gonna go, right? So no one's really touching that one yet, and that's down the road. But you saw there's already places that are being affected by flooding. So it's definitely being talked about, and I know the state here has sort of made resources available for flood planning, which is actually probably one of the major effects in Montclair, in this area of flooding.
And I'm not mistaken, some European countries are pretty advanced in this, is it?
Well, Holland's been for a long time. In fact, they're getting consulted
Yeah.
all over the place now because
Right.
they've managed to hold the sea off
Right.
really, really well. They've created buffers and that, you know, where you have to buy out properties because that's where your buffer has to be.
Yeah. You could do that too.
But I think one of our biggest dangers is we say it's down the road, but if we
Yeah.
don't take action now,
Yeah.
you know, it's sort of like, you know, people are, you know, in Depression time trying to sell life insurance or something like that. You know, it's not, no, it's not tangible, and you don't worry about, you worry about all the issues we have in front of us now.
Yes, yeah.
And people like, don't want to think about 20 years
But
from
all, and these big projects take a long time. I mean, the whole system that the Dutch have took 50 years to
Right.
plan and build. Those, whatever, I forget what they call that system.
Boulders or something like that, yeah, or dikes. Yeah, so I actually want to talk about, like, I want to spend a good time talking about things we do as individuals in society. Let's hear one more reaction.
I find it almost debilitating when you speak. I feel like I just want to go watch TV or take a nap. Shut down, because it feels like I can't do anything. What am I,
You're
there's
overwhelmed.
nothing I can do.
You get overwhelmed.
I recycle, like you hear, is my little triangle one thing in the recycle bin really gonna make a difference? Like, it's nothing. It feels like a spit in the ocean.
Well, actually, I want to talk about that, exactly. So I actually want to talk about, like, what you can do, right? Because so this is Mitzvah Day, what can you do, right?
Yeah.
So what can we do and what should we do? So the important thing, like I said, it's not too late, right? Because a lot of gloom and doom, and we don't do anything. And I will note, by the way, speaking of children and grandchildren, if you look at the projections, there's a certain amount of global warming is already baked in, correct phrase. And if you look at the projections, no matter what we do towards around 2050, things will probably, even if we cut off emissions today, it'll probably be about similar. But where really things start to diverge is after 2050. Things can start to stabilize and then sort of level off in a way that's manageable, or they can actually really go up. So like I probably won't be around in 2050. You never know, but my kids will be, I hope, and grandkids. So it's really about thinking about future generations. But that being said, it is still possible to bend the curve. If you look at the projections, we're kind of locked into stuff for the next couple decades, but what we do now can make a big difference down the road. And it's important to remember that. So it's not like all those effects I listed are not things, many of them are things that have already happened, but a lot of are things that might happen, but we could still prevent. It's a matter of degrees, but literally 1 degree can make a huge difference. So what can we do and what should we do? So when you talk to climate experts, how to respond, they usually throw around 2 big words. One is adaptation and the other is mitigation. Adaptation means adapting to the effects of changing climate, preparing ourselves for what at this point, like I said, is inevitable, at least in the next couple of decades, so we can weather our changes. Mitigation is about taking steps to prevent as much global warming as possible, generally by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So let's say a little bit of adaptation. This goes to what you were talking about earlier. It's a little simpler. I want to focus on Montclair. Montclair is actually in a bit of a better place than a lot of other localities. We're not on the coast, so we're not going to be directly impacted by sea level rise. In fact, I once figured out if all the ice caps in the world melted, the sea would rise to basically Ridgewood Avenue in Glen Ridge. So we would be shore town. It would take, yeah, for real estate. It would actually take several centuries, so none of us, not even our grandkids, don't have to worry about that. But and we're hoping to prevent that. But so we're not going to be directly. So there could be like people, refugees, right? But we're not going to be directly affected by sea level rise. It's not going to get so hot that we can't live here. The century will be like Georgia. I grew up in Texas. It's completely habitable, right? We're not facing major droughts. Still, there are things that we need to prepare for. One is extreme heat. We will have more and more heat waves, so I have to think about how to deal with that. And the other is extreme weather. Dealing with extreme weather means we need to address flooding through green infrastructure type things, like we were talking about earlier. Think about how, because we have Tony's Brook that runs through town, and this other, how are we going to deal with that? It also means we need to build resilience into our electrical grid. Maybe you were probably here with Sandy. I was here. I lost power for almost 2 weeks. So we need to build an electrical grid and other infrastructure that can stand sort of more extreme weather. At the city level, we can build what are called microgrids, which are basically like small electrical grids that are so self-sufficient. There's a proposal to build one down by the fire station. You can actually do it yourself. You get solar panels and a battery, and boom, you have your own microgrid. You can survive to some extent off the grid if necessary, right? And I'll actually say a little bit more about that in a minute. My brother-in-law, who lives in California, did that. He has a child with asthma. He wanted to be able to run the air conditioning. They were having power outages, so he put in solar panels, put in batteries, and now he can run the AC if he needs to, right? So you can basically correct it. So that's why. So think about resilience as an important sort of buzzword in climate adaptation. So that's a little bit about adaptation, but I want to talk mostly about mitigation, what we can do as individuals and citizens to cut greenhouse gases. It's helpful first to get the big picture. I have those little brochures here, and we have on the inside a little chart where things come from. Greenhouse gas emissions generally come from 4 main sources, which is helpful to think about what we can do, right? So they come from buildings. That means mostly heating, like fuel oil and natural gas, also a few other things like stoves. Electricity, which comes from burning fossil fuels in power plants. Transportation, like burning gasoline and diesel cars and trucks and things. And finally, trash. Usually methane from landfills, although Montclair are burned at the incinerator in Essex, so there's emissions from that. So buildings, electricity, transportation, and trash. Whatever, BTD. So if you want to do something, we have to deal with those four things: buildings, electricity, transportation, trash, as the individuals and as a society. So let's start with trash. It's actually not a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's only about like 5%.
Oh.
But it is something. And frankly, here in Montclair, this is actually a big environmental justice issue because our trash gets burned in the Newark incinerator in the Ironbound community, which is the neighborhood. If you know, there's already a lot of pollution there. It's already fairly overburdened. So anything we can do to help reduce the burden of that community is, I think, something that we should do. So what should you do? Well, first, let's like reduce, reuse, recycle, and we'll include composting as part of recycling. So use less. The less you use, the less you throw away, right? And of course, reuse and repair when you can. I've actually been trying to be more mindful of this over the past year because I did an environmental justice walk last summer. And since then, I've made a real effort to kind of reduce or reuse so I don't burden the folks down by the incinerator if you are afraid. And of course, recycle and compost. Recycling does work, especially for metal and glass, also for paper. It's less effective for plastic, but so you should use as little as possible. That being said, there is recycling in plastic. So if you do use it, try to recycle. And as for composting, does anyone here compost? Good for you. I've not been able to convince my wife to do it yet. So you can do it yourself. You get it in your backyard. There's also a service called Java's Compost. They'll actually come and collect it. Yes.
I have a question about plastic.
Yes.
I'm seeing commercials from like some of the major corporations promoting the plastic that they're using as being environmentally friendly. Is that right? Do you
Probably
know?
not. I mean, so there's first the greenhouse gas, there's the climate change stuff, and that a lot of it comes from the trash that gets burned or composted, and also just the production involves all fossil fuels. There's a separate question about like trash and like in the environments or waste, and that's a separate issue, but it's really important. So I think I try to avoid using plastic as much as possible. It's really hard to do, right, because so much is plastic.
Yeah.
But you can speak with your wallet too, so like eggs is a perfect example. Some of the brands of eggs come in plastic or in that styrofoam.
Yeah.
And
So,
others come in the
in the
cardboard.
cardboard, so
Yeah.
if you, it might cost you more, but if you can afford to do it,
Yeah.
I never buy the eggs in plastic, even when they're outside. I just
Yeah.
don't do it.
So I would avoid it if you can for a variety of reasons.
Okay.
And again, people sometimes say, oh, plastics doesn't recycle. That's actually not true. Plastic can get recycled, or some downcycle technique, so it can be done. So if you have a chance to recycle your plastic in Montclair's 1, 2, and 5, definitely do it. And some of it will probably get recycled.
Can I ask you a question? How come your wife is resistant to compost?
She has a very sensitive nose. She doesn't want like buckets of garbage around.
I gotta tell you, it doesn't smell at all.
That's what, so
It's
I'm
odorless.
working on it. And like I said, if you don't want to do it yourself, a number of members of our group are this company called Java's Compost, and you pay a monthly fee, and you put out the bucket every week or every 2 weeks, and they come and collect it, and then at the end of the season you can compost. The advantage of doing that is you can compost things that you can't compost on your own, like all food scraps, compostable materials from restaurants. So if you really want to go for composting, you do it costs. I forget the cost, so it does cost, as opposed to doing it yourself, which is free.
My husband goes out and
Have they run the numbers on that, like driving a truck to pick up things to, I mean, is it a carbon positive?
So I don't know that. I mean, I'd have another, and part of the problem here in New Jersey is we don't actually have an industrial composting facility. That being said, they just passed a law, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago, to really sort of, without going into detail, to try to get industrial composting. So right now the composting actually gets driven up to New York. But if you get, the idea is if you get
Doesn't
enough,
sound like that's gonna work out.
but if you get enough composting here, then there'll be a market for composting. And then if there was a place in like Newark or, I don't know, Roseland or Livingston somewhere, then it would probably be worthwhile.
But if your compost is going in the garbage and then the garbage is going to landfill, what's the difference between that and composting for your garbage? I mean, it's still going into the earth, right? And it's still like.
No, there was two things. First of all, our garbage gets burned. Our garbage doesn't get landfilled, it gets burned and then the waste, so that produces emissions there. It's actually worse than landfilling. And also landfilling tends to produce, I think, higher levels of methane gas. And you can design a landfill to catch it with some escapes, and methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. It's actually much worse than CO2.
But doesn't composting create methane? I mean, that's,
Not the same level as my
I
impression.
think the reason that
rot
composting.
is rot. I mean,
The difference is this, when you
bacteria is
compost,
bacteria.
one of the most important pieces of composting is that you're
Yes.
constantly aerating it.
correct.
And so I think that the methane gets.
But the methane produced, well, anyway.
I believe it's
Worms
about,
don't fuck that much.
I believe it's about aerobic versus anaerobic composition. I mean, I'll look at it. So my impression is that, because when it's in a landfill, it's basically cut off from air. That's why things
Yeah.
can survive along. And that's conditions that tend to produce more methane. Whereas when you compost, you're supposed to like stir it all the time. And so that produces a different kind of rotting, and therefore it doesn't produce the same amount of methane gas. Since it's actually methane is the risky thing. So I'll look into the numbers.
So
but-
methane's like 9 times worse than carbon in terms of.
Than CO2, yes, absolutely. I mean, the good news is it goes away really rapidly. It doesn't, like, the CO2 we dump in the atmosphere will be there for centuries. The methane will go away in a decade or two. So we can cut methane emissions, the effects on global warming will actually be pretty rapid. But again, so that's something I was reduce, reuse, recycle, compost. That's one thing you can do. How about, remember, the second thing is electricity. What can you do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from electricity? Well, the simplest thing, it's small, it's turn off lights, right? Easy to do, in fact, it's small, but it's something, so you might as well do it. Next up is to install efficient light bulbs and appliances like LED light bulbs. If you have, hope you are using LED light bulbs. If you're not, you should definitely switch. They save you money.
We just switched in this room.
They last forever. They're great. I can actually see my electricity bill going down when I put in LED light bulbs. But what if you already done that? A lot of you may have already done that. What's the next thing? Well, the next thing is to buy renewable electricity. In New Jersey, you can choose your energy supplier, and you can choose a company that will provide all renewable electricity. And later, if you want to know what that means, we can talk about that. I've been buying from a company called Clean Choice Energy for several years now, so that's one company I can recommend. They recommend me by Sierra Club and 350. If you live in Montclair, you can actually join the energy aggregation program and then opt up to 100% renewable electricity. It's actually a little more expensive than the PSE&G price. It works out to, for a typical house, it's like $5 a month. It's like the price of a fancy latte at Starbucks. But I think I hope you're willing to invest $5 a month in like the future of your kids. You think about how much we pay for education, activities, gifts, travel, all the things we spend on our kids. $5 a month seems like a real bargain. So you can call to opt up. I meant to write down the number. It's actually on our website. If you live in Montclair, it's also Glen Ridge and Verona, Livingston. It's called Sustainable Essex Alliance. There's 7 towns in it. Anyone who's in town can call the supplier called Energy Harbor and say, I want to opt up.
It's Energy Harbor.
Energy Harbor. And yeah, the number's on our website. We have a page about the Sustainable Essex Alliance. I meant to write it down. I just forgot.
So just, David, can you explain one thing? Does that simply mean that you're not using fossil fuel for your electricity? You're going to use some sort of solar energy instead? I'm not quite sure what it really means.
It's complicated. So buying renewable electricity is complicated. I actually think it's a good idea, partly because by doing it, you're encouraging the development of more renewable electricity, right? Because it's extremely complicated, to put it mildly. But within the Energy Harbor, the contract we've signed with them is they will provide electricity from what are called Class 1 renewables, which usually in our area means wind power. To some extent, solar power. There's a lot of wind power.
Where's the wind power in New Jersey generated?
It's actually in Pennsylvania, so it's from our region.
Okay.
Texas is actually a major supplier of wind power, but most of what they buy is actually in our region, in our particular.
You're actually just
region.
directing your money, because the power, the electrons of the
Yeah,
electrons.
exactly.
It
So
goes into the grid, from the wind power people.
Right.
And you're directing you're paying a higher rate.
Yes.
To give them the money, so that encourages them to make more.
Wind power.
exactly.
Right.
It's
very
like
confusing.
I always use it like water. Imagine you have like 2 spigots, like hot, like clean water and dirty water, and they all
Right.
come out of the same faucet. So if you like turn down the dirty faucet and open the clean faucet, or like hot and cold, it's still water coming out, but the mix of water is going to be different. So by buying this, you're encouraging companies to like turn up the renewable energy
Right.
spigot and turn down the other. So,
It's
but
really
the electricity is
confusing.
just electricity, right? There's no like clean electron versus. That's what makes it complicated. But I think so I think really your effect in the long run is you're encouraging the creation of more renewable electricity by buying.
Because we get the mailings, like gosh, almost every day from Clean Choice Energy, and I never really understood. So you're saying that is a reputable company? Because we got
It is, yeah. I've been subscribing for years. I know a guy named Eric Benson in town. He was with the environmental group, and he used to buy it also. He actually now does the opt-up. My contract with Clean Choice is about to run out, and I'm actually going to switch to the opt-up, which is actually cheaper because they negotiate a really good price. But Clean Choices, I've been buying. It is a little more expensive, but it's not phenomenally more expensive. You can afford it. I actually
This
agree
is
with
the
you.
problem I have with something like a lot of this thinking. And I'm all for it, but the reason it's not, if it's $5 more in New Jersey where we pay incredibly high energy rates, then in Ohio, it's $1 a month a house, right? And if it really were $1 a month a house, you could just pass a law, everything's gotta be wind, we all pay $1 a month more, and it's the problem solved. But what's not taking into account is the heavy subsidies that taxpayers pay for the wind power that really reduce the price. So we couldn't just multiply it across the country and do it. If everybody did this, there wouldn't be enough wind power, and we'd have to have so much subsidy that it's not tenable.
Right,
So that's where I struggle, because I think we should do things that have effect rather than just feel good. My son, when he was at Rand, did a science fair project. They put these solar power lights in front of we live next door. They put these solar powered lights. We noticed they didn't work very well. They shut off at 9:30 at night because the batteries die or whatever. So he did a little study of like how much did they cost, how much did they save, what does the maintenance cost, how long will they last. It's a terrible deal. I mean, they got to cut a nice ribbon and everybody's environmental. And then he went and talked to PSE&G and found out some numbers about weather stripping. Because he went to that school and said it's freezing in the winter and it's hot in the summer because the weather stripping is terrible. And he estimated the windows, and he estimated how much would be saved. 100 times more money would have been saved if they just did weather stripping.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel good, and you can't take a picture of cutting the ribbon in front of the weather stripping. So that's where I get a little lost in some of these solutions, because it's about feeling good and not actually about accomplishing a lot.
Well, I think that electricity, buying renewable electricity, the long run does switch. We are going to have to build up. We actually are doing it in this state. They're building lots of you've heard like the offshore wind is actually very big. New Jersey's hoping to be like a big player in offshore wind. And community solar program, which I was talking about earlier, is another attempt to build up the sort of electricity. Because you're correct. If everyone switched now, it wouldn't work. Like our group is pushing to have sustainable Essex lines move towards all renewable electricity, but we want it to be like by the end of the decade. So you're correct. There's going to have to involve a lot of this, and probably the easiest way to do it is simply to simply require utilities to provide more and more. Because if there's a law saying by 2030 you have to have 50 or 75%, 100% renewable electricity, then suppliers will know, and that will create an incentive to do it. The question of cost is an interesting one because
there's also a question of motivation. If people do things that they feel like it's going to solve a problem, and it does a very tiny marginal thing, they feel like they've done their part. It's like there's this thing called Amazon Smile, which is a fundraising thing for not-for-profits. You put it on your website, you get Amazon free advertising, and you get like $20 a year for Shomrei, right? But it makes people feel like they've done something to support when it's nothing.
So actually
want
want
to subsidies though, because what really is subsidized is fossil fuel.
Well, yeah, all that. I'm just saying. I wish we could go for things that are less sexy, that are more effective.
No, but switching our subsidies to develop renewables, that's that's been under-subsidized, whereas the fossil fuels have been over-subsidized. We're still subsidizing our government.
Right. That's a different.
But encouraging what you said, the taxpayer's going to have to pay for it. We are paying for it. We're helping to subsidize the fossil fuels.
So I actually want to say, I was going to say this later, I'll say it now. The question was to come up with your audience, can what I do as an individual really make a difference? Does it matter whether I do this? And that could be everything. It could be like weatherizing my house. It could be driving an electric car. It could be buying renewable. It doesn't really make a difference. I'm just one person. How much difference? How big? This is sort of early. How big will the emissions cuts be if I get rid of my gas car, switch to 100% renewable electricity? Well, how much a difference will my individual thing make to greenhouse gas emissions? Of course, the answer is not that much, right? You're only one person. There's 3 billion people on the planet. So if you're looking at the direct impact of your change, you're right. The effect is probably pretty minimal. That being said, I think you should do it anyway, right? And why? Well, first of all, I think it's the right thing to do, right? I think we have a moral obligation to do what we can. If I can help even a little bit, I should. It shows good character, it's the right thing to do. To be honest, this is one of my main motivations going in. I have 2 kids, and I'm both off in college, but I got involved about 10 years ago with climate stuff, partly because I wanted to be able to say to them, in 20 years, I tried. Hopefully you accomplish something. Even if I didn't, I think, look, I tried, right? I did the best I could. So you should never give up on doing the right thing. That's why you should take action, even if it's a small one. Beyond that, actions can also inspire others. If I put up solar panels on my roof, someone else on my block may see them and say, hey, I should try that. Or if I drive an electric car, people see electric cars driving around and say, I guess there's a lot more electric cars. Maybe I should look into that. And you can amplify this effect if you actually talk to people, like not in an obnoxious way or a smug way, right? But talk about your new induction stove, or your renewable electricity, or biking around town, whatever it is you do. Tell people how you're doing it for the climate, for your kids, for your grandkids. The more we talk about this, the more normal it becomes, right? Because the more likely other people are to do it too. In fact, talking about climate change and with your friends and neighbors is probably actually one of the most important things you can do. The more we talk about climate change, the more we share our hopes, our fears, what we're doing, our actions, the more other people are likely to support actions or take action themselves. If everyone is worried about climate change and no one talks about it, then you can end up in a situation where everyone's worried, but everyone thinks no one else is worried, right? Sociologists call this pluralistic ignorance. And the only way out of this is to talk about climate change. I know certain climate activists who make it a point to talk at least once a day with someone about climate change because they want to get the idea out there. Because it's true in the end, individual action is enough. I'm going to talk about more individual actions in a minute, but it's true that we have to take social action as well, and I'll talk more about sort of that and what you can do in that regard. And you're right, we want to sort of be smart about where we're spending our money. So you want to think about all the things you can do. Is it best for me to spend my money on composting or on an electric car or weatherizing my house, or what can we do? But there are individual things that you can do, and that's why I think you should do them. As I said, so renewable electricity, you can actually put on solar panels. I have solar panels on my roof. I got about 9 months out of the year, I have an electricity bill essentially because I generate more power than I consume. There's an upfront cost, but you can finance it. They pay for the solar panels. I got a company called Momentum Solar, which I like. They last for their guarantee for 20 years, and they probably pay for themselves like 10 or 15. So it takes a while, but it does pay back.
Can you just talk about the disposal of the panels?
I actually don't. There are people talking about recycling them. It's actually pretty new.
Okay.
It's actually a lot of it, of course, is just silicon. And it's like glass, and you can melt it down. That's one of the things about glass. You can melt it. I'm sure there's stuff in the panels, not just pure glass.
Okay. I was just curious if that has been a discussion.
People are talking about the same thing with batteries. People are talking
Right.
about recycling batteries.
Right.
And there are definitely environmental things there. Although I always like to remind people, we have to deal with batteries and solar panels. But if we do it right, that means we won't have to deal with, the ice sheets collapsing or the Gulf Stream stopping, stuff like that. So you always have to think about not the cost of this, but what's the cost of inaction. You always have to keep that in mind. That's important to me. Transportation, the obvious thing is getting an electric car. They're very sexy. They're a little more expensive, although they're actually, again, in the long run, cheaper to operate because the maintenance is minimal, and driving on gas is cheaper than driving electricity is cheaper than driving on gas. To be honest, another big thing you do is walk more. I'm actually really lucky. I live in town, I work in town, I've actually been taken to walking to work. Now that my kids are in college, I don't have to drive to school anymore, so not everyone can do this, but if you can, walk more, bike more, take public transportation. I walk 30 minutes, I actually really enjoy it. Get outside, feels much more human than to be like in a car. I really enjoy it. But now I recognize everyone can do this. So you'd be surprised, I have a friend around town, she would ride everywhere on her bicycle. It'd be 20 degrees, she'd be riding her bicycle with her kids with her. So you'd be surprised what you can do if you put your bike to it. So transportation, drive an electric car, walk, bike, public transportation as much as possible. Finally, there's buildings. You're absolutely correct. Energy efficiency is actually, that's the cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. And so anything you can do, weather stripping, insulation, is something you should absolutely do. You can get an energy audit and figure out where you can save electricity. And sometimes those steps will actually they pay for themselves in a few years because we save so much. Beyond that, it becomes much harder. Eventually, we're going to have to electrify everything, like turn all our gas and fuel oil into electric, but that's down the road. The technology is still developing. I wouldn't actually encourage anyone to do this until you've done everything else you can. The one other thing to keep in mind that it's small, but a lot of people are talking about now is like replacing gas stoves with induction stoves. Has anyone ever had?
Yeah, I just heard about that. We have a gas stove, and I'm looking, I was just reading about that.
Yeah, they're telling, do you have one?
No, but I've used one, and they heat up like that.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. They heat just like, it's like
But
using
you
gas
have to
stoves.
have the right pans.
Right, so you can't, like, I have some copper bottom pans, they won't work. Basically, if your magnet will stick to your pan, it can work, because it uses magnetic fields. If you think about it, like think about how hard we work to like have the exhaust from our natural gas furnaces out the flue or not in the house, and then we just like turn on this flame in our kitchen. So apparently it can also make a difference to the air quality in your house. But mostly it's just like methane is a major greenhouse gas, that's what you're burning your stove, so you can switch to induction. I have a gas stove, we're not replacing it yet, because I also think like it's also cheaper to like keep stuff going, or better for keep stuff going, but when we replace it, I'm sure we'll buy an induction stove. I've heard they're really good. Small thing, but like you're replacing your stove, go ahead and do it, and apparently they're really, really good. So those things you can do as individuals: recycle, buy renewable electricity, solar panels, bike and walk more, and so on. But as I said, it's good to do because it's the right thing to do. You can inspire others to do it, but in the end, individual action isn't going to be enough. We don't have time to convince people one-on-one. We have to change the system.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
On here, you didn't have farming, and we were maybe no
right,
farms
right,
in
yeah,
Montclair,
yeah.
but actually we all buy food.
That's true.
I mean,
Yeah, I
we
should
all
have put
eat,
that on
so
there.
that's a whole other.
Yes, so another thing you can do, that's absolutely correct, is sort of use less, particularly beef and dairy, actually, which is too bad because I love cheese. But yeah, so if you look at it, those are the most greenhouse effects. There's a few others. Actually, I have a chart on my computer, which I don't have with me. But you're absolutely correct. So the less meat you eat, the better. But particularly the worst thing is beef. Grass-fed beef actually is not as bad. It's actually can be okay. In fact, cattle raised right, they can actually sort of sequester carbon. The problem is that we couldn't possibly raise enough beef in that way to feed all the beef in the country, right? So it's just not, it would just be way too expensive. So that's good in theory, but in practice, they can't feed beef to 300 million people. That's what grass is. Say it again?
What's wrong with dairy?
Dairy cows.
Dairy cows, methane.
Oh, the cows.
The cows produce methane. So yeah, the cheese is fine, but it's the methane that the cows produce. So it's not as bad as beef. Beef is by far the worst. Between deforestation, a lot of our beef comes from the United States. And you go out west, there's like beef out there, but the way a lot of cattle is raised, particularly in feedlots, they produce a lot of methane gas, and that's the problem. Like I said, the good news about methane gas, it doesn't last long in the atmosphere, so you can like, get rid of it pretty rapidly. But it is
It's an amazing percentage that, I forget, I was reading about how much the Belgian cows.
Yeah. So
produces.
that's
amazing, yeah.
I should add that. We have this is just the beta version. I'll actually add that to there because that is important, right? But like I said, in the end, it's not something that then we're gonna have to like change the systems, change the rules to make it harder or more expensive to use fossil fuels, or make it easier, cheaper to use renewable energy. And there's a lot of policies that are proposed, like carbon fee and dividend, renewable electricity standards, subsidies for electric cars, building out car charters, and so on. For example, like I talked about Montclair, half the population of Montclair is renters, right? If you live in an apartment building, it's really hard currently to get an electric car, because where are you going to charge it, right? I have a friend in Verona, she was climbing back for 2 years, she just moved to her house in Verona, the downsized to rental, she can't get an electric car or plug-in hybrid because she has no place to charge it. So we need the town, the county, the state to commit to building out public charters so everyone can get electric vehicles, including renters, which is also, I said, it's a matter of social justice. A lot of renters are sort of lower middle income. Make sure that all people have access to it. So ultimately, I think the most important thing you can do is actually join a campaign, or join an organization, lobby public officials, demand strong climate policies, put pressure on banks to cut off financing costs. There's lots of things you can do. There's lots of organizations. There's Climate Action. There's also a local group of Citizens Climate Lobby. At the state level, there's an alliance of groups called Empower New Jersey.
Power of New Jersey.
Empower New Jersey. You can get on their mailing list every Monday. They send out an action you can take. It'll take you 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Of course, there's lots of other organizations. I'm involved in a group called Extinction Rebellion, which has an actions plan in April. There's 350 young people. There's the Sunrise Movement. Climate activist Bill Mckibben, you may have heard of. He's just started a movement for us older people called Third Act, which is like the Sunrise Movement for people who are older. So there's lots of options, but you should pick one and get involved. Bill Mckibben said in one of his articles that the solution to climate change is organizing, because we have to it's good to do things individually, and I think you should do it, but ultimately we have to change the whole system to have the desired effect. We got into this mess together. We're going to get out of it together. So that's what I would suggest. So that's what I would suggest. Now, other questions or comments, thoughts you want to share?
One takeaway, did you say that the garbage is 5% of the problem?
For approximately, if you look at because people do studies about where greenhouse gas emissions come from, and it's about 5%.
Yeah.
It's
That
less
makes
than
me feel
it's less than.
Now I can throw it over to
Well, okay,
Probably
do what
mostly
you
from
can.
trucking it,
but you still
Actually,
have
mostly.
reduced it.
Well, actually, I
I know,
think
of course.
no, because they would probably include that in transportation. It's methane. It's mostly methane gas from landfills. Transportation is actually the biggest one. Like I said, the big three are transportation, buildings, electricity. And so that's one of the problems with switching to electric cars. If you have an electric car and you're using coal, comes from coal, you're actually probably worse off. So you have to think about holistically, right? And you're absolutely correct. You want to think about where if you've got a limited amount of money to spend, seriously, weather strip your home. Energy efficiency is where it's at.
All right.
But if you've done that, then you can work on other things as well. Yes.
I guess one of the other questions I have is, when we look globally at global warming, what percentage of the problem is created by China and India?
Well, we're 25%.
Well, we're
Yeah,
a huge percentage.
China is the largest. India's actually pretty small still.
Is it?
Yeah,
So
it is.
industrialized. I mean, that's the
Exactly.
problem.
Exactly.
China's
So,
industrializing now, which is why it's exploding.
Right, so what was the percentage? I missed that.
is it 25? I don't know the numbers.
I thought the US was responsible for 25%.
It's a big number.
It's a big number.
And of course the other thing is, and the people look at this from an environmental justice perspective. They look at what are we producing? But if you look at the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're 60%.
The United States has been doing it for
For much
100
longer.
years, and
Yeah.
we
Right.
benefit from it now. We tell the emerging countries you can't do it.
Yeah. Now that being said, second in terms of total contribution to is actually China, because China is so large and they've been
Well, we
so
also
industrial.
just exported a lot of our polluting
Right.
industries to a
Right.
country
That's
where they're
correct.
poor and.
Right. And some people, and you say people are like, well, what can the U.S. do? And the answer is the U.S. can do a lot. First of all, 25%, but also the U.S. If the U.S. is willing to step up and take the lead, that will help other countries feel that they should do something also. Because like it or not, people look to us or use us as an excuse. Well, the U.S. isn't doing anything, so why should we? Right? The Europeans are actually pretty good. There's issues with hitting high, difficult targets. The Europeans are starting to hit them, usually political ones, because it involves building a lot of infrastructure, green infrastructure, and you start to hit resistance. And maybe you've been following the wind farms off of New Jersey. A lot of people on the shore don't want them.
Yeah.
I think that I've seen wind farms in California, and I think they look kind of cool.
Well, would they rather move, or would they rather look at windmills?
Well, so that's exactly, they think, well, of course, part of the problem is they're living there, they may not be here in 50 years when the problem is bad, right? So
It's
it's
very
easy.
relaxing watching windmill go around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're very far off, they're very far offshore.
Right.
And there's so this is what, there's been a lot of resistance in a lot of places to building out infrastructure. And so you have to approach it in a very sensitive way to make sure that you consult with people on the ground. But again, the alternative is to keep using fossil fuels, and we know where that's going to go. So this has come up recently. There's been a lot of discussion about cost of renewable, because the subsidies questions come up, because a lot of community solar and other things are subsidized by ratepayers, and the analysis. So if you look at the analysis of the cost of renewable electricity, people say it's going to cost X. The problem with the analysis is it does not include the cost of not doing anything, right? So they say, it's going to cost $100 million, but what they don't say it's going to cost $100 million, they get the figure right, $100 million, but we're going to save $200 million because we won't have the effect. So that's the problem with the cost benefit analysis that's currently being run.
Is there anybody, so what my feeling is that the only way it's gonna get better is if the cost of pollution becomes more costly.
Yes.
So, which means a tax, some kind of federal tax structure, because the states will just compete to lower taxes if we leave it to the states.
Yeah.
And if gasoline were permanently $7 a gallon, a lot of people would ride bikes, and it would help a lot. would hurt a lot, but it would help a lot. But
In Europe,
so-
fuel is much more expensive.
Yeah, so my question is there any organization?
it's
because
it's
when-
regressive.
Instead of, like you said, subsidizing the solution, you actually have to tax the cost. Like the taxes should represent actually what it's gonna cost as is. Not just to produce it, but to live with the consequences. And when you start factoring it in that way, you're gonna have a higher tax structure. So who's advocating for that? That's what I want.
I can tell you, a group called Citizens Climate Lobby, they advocate what's called a fee and dividend, where you basically put a carbon tax, they call it carbon fee, on fossil fuels. It starts low and then rises steadily, like starts at $10 a barrel, $10 a ton, and then goes up and up from there. And so they have this, so that would drive up the cost, and then all that money would then be sent back to households into dividends. So every month, everything in the trust fund would be paid out as a check to homeowners, which sounds like it wouldn't get anywhere, but because the cost and the benefit are like not the same, it would have the effect of increasing the cost of fossil fuels. And some of that money would go to paying, but in the long run, as fossil fuels went up, it would become cheaper to install heat pump in your house, for example, or cheaper to get an electric car, or cheaper to whatever. So that's the major organization.
What's the name of it?
It's called Citizens Climate Lobby.
And that's New Jersey or?
It's a national organization. It's actually international. The problem with it, and this is where you get into the political stuff, no one likes to see increased costs, and so most people think about the politics that would say subsidies are better because everyone likes to have things cheaper, right? The other thing is, and even something like what we have in New Jersey, where there's it's called a Renewable Portfolio Standard, where the government has, the PSNG is required by law to provide a certain amount of electricity from renewables, it's now about 25%. That's essentially a hidden subsidy. It costs more, but people don't see it as a separate bill, right? And so it's easier to put in place. So I've always said carbon fee dividend, most economists would agree that's exactly the right thing to do. It's just been politically really difficult. Canada did something recently, but they didn't do it, and they actually have something like that, but they didn't do a great job of implementing it. And so there's been a fair amount of resistance to it. And there's a lot of people who don't really understand it. But if you're interested, that's the organization, Citizens Climate Lobby. There is a local group. They operate at the federal level. There's actually a proposal to do that at the state level also. There's a group trying to get that in New Jersey, but you're correct, it would work better at the national level.
Yeah, because other states will just attract business by not doing it.
It would also have the advantage of, they would also tax imports based on their carbon usage. So it would essentially keep companies from saying, oh, it's too expensive here, I'm gonna move my plant to Brazil where they don't do this. Well, you wouldn't escape the tax because it would be taxed on the inside. So it would actually, and we've also, it would actually give other countries an incentive to adopt this, because if we tax products from China, we get the money. But if they start having carbon tax on their products, then they get the money. So it actually would solve a lot of problems. I was actually involved with Citizens Climate Lobby for a long time, and for a variety of reasons, I'm not as involved in them anymore. But the politics of it are very hard to handle, because once you start talking about, especially these days, start telling people you're going to raise gas prices, and they do not want to hear it.
All right, well, it is 12:30.
Yeah, so I don't want, so, I'm sorry.
And I'm happy to stay and talk more, but I just wanted to note, it is 12:30.
Okay, so
All right.
5 more minutes and then we'll.
No,
wrap it
no,
up.
5 minutes, yeah.
Okay,
Do
fine,
you mind?
whatever.
You're good?
I can stay all day. I have some more, so that's fine. So other questions or thoughts? So I would look into them, because they're a good organization.
I do have a question about public opinion on this.
Yes.
Are people up for taking this on? Like, in terms of, are there numbers of people who, in other words, are we ready as a country to do this?
Well, I think it's interesting. If you look at the polling results, the answer is yes. A large majority of Americans believe climate change is real, believe it's caused by people, and support in certain policies to address it. In practice, if you look at what issues people prioritize, environment is always really low on the list.
Yeah.
And part of the problem is it's not very immediate, right? If you see inflation, then you go fill up your car and you see it. Climate change is something that's it's happening, and people can read in the news, but it's very slow motion, and it's mostly the bad effects are going to come 30 years down the road, right? 30, 40, 50 years down the road.
That's why.
Although I will
that makes
show
it hard to
people
do.
that it's
It does.
In our area.
Say it again?
So I said, if it's not so far down the road, because we really are feeling the effects now.
Yes.
And so I think really showing people how we're already feeling the effects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is, I think, the way to go then.
On the other hand, the problem is like, okay, so we're feeling the effects now, but like, it's not like we live in like a post-apocalyptic hellscape here in Montclair, right? So global warming is real, it's happening, but most people can sort of get on with their lives in this part of the world in a particular way. And even something like Ida, it's hard to draw the connection because you can never say, oh, that storm is a result of global warming, right? Because it's all about possibility. So that makes it, the messaging is really hard. So the answer is yes in theory, but it's really hard to figure out how to present it in a way that people are willing to go
The
along with
messaging
it.
is a problem. I mean, it's the gloom and doom shuts people down.
Right.
It just simply does, so.
But it's,
somehow-
I was thinking about this today, like there's an article in the paper about like, you know, higher gas prices are saying people should drill. And my response is, if we have higher gas prices, the response would be we should switch to renewables right away. Because once we switch to renewables, Russia, Saudi Arabia can do whatever they want with petroleum, we don't care. Like,
Yeah,
fine.
well, that's a good
Go
incentive
wild.
right there, right
And so,
now.
but it's interesting how it's being framed. It's being framed as like, oh, we have these high gas prices, we should drill more. Whereas I think strictly we have high gas prices, we should accelerate the transition to renewable energy because that one is.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
agenda's, I mean, it just needs to be more public, like New Jersey has high energy prices. I'm just finding out right now that we get 25% from renewables, which is probably related to our high energy prices, but it's not described that way. So I just assume when my sister in Colorado pays way less for electricity than I do, that something's wrong with New Jersey, rather than saying, well, New Jersey's, I'm paying a higher price,
Yeah.
but we're using 25% renewables, so that should be something I feel good about.
Uh-huh.
But it's not clear, it's not explained,
Yeah.
it's hidden. That's part of the problem,
Yeah.
messaging. So it should feel like an investment,
But
but it feels like a dirty secret.
And I think investment is the best way to think about it. If you think of like, oh, I'm paying $5 a month more for electricity, that seems depressing. If you think of it as like, I'm paying a $5 a month investment to help my children have a better planet, then suddenly it's like, oh, actually, I'm really glad to be able to do this. So you're right, the messaging is an issue, and people have talked, like, climate activists think a lot about messaging, because it's really hard for a variety of reasons. So if you look at the polling, a lot of Americans are really, like, support for a lot of things is actually quite high, like 70, 80%. It's often quite bipartisan even.
Good.
But
it's a matter of
but
priority.
it's a matter of priority. If you look at what people say that matters to them, most people put other stuff much higher
Politicians
than
aren't listening to
environment.
what.
Yes.
Here's an interesting
Just like,
question.
let's say another 2 or 3 questions.
Okay, that's fine.
Good idea. You're in education. It's an interesting question about how much of global warming or climate change is the new phrase everybody's using. When I grew up, it was global warming, is part of the curriculum, science curriculum in schools. Because when you start including climate change as part of a fundamental science program, starting in grade kindergarten, I mean, the way that they've changed the curriculums in history regarding racism and, you know, what is it, American role in international history, whether or not people are talking about changing curriculum within the public
My
schools.
kids were just, you know, both my kids are in college, just like we were now, they're completely apocalyptic about it.
Yeah.
Because of their education. Their education has taught them there's nothing we can do.
But that's the point. Perhaps the education has to change and say, we have to be activists as opposed to doomists, or whatever the word would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Doomist, that's a new word.
There's actually, I've read about the OK Doomer movement, which is like criticizing
Is that
people
the OK?
who are too gloomy.
Yeah,
gloomy
yeah,
about
there was
the
a good
idea.
article in today's Times actually about being more positive about climate change.
Right, and it's a balance, right? Because if you don't do anything, and again, it's not that like, so 100 years from now, like at the end of the century, Montclair would be like Georgia. Georgia, also not a post-apocalyptic hellscape, right? It's fine, you can
Yeah.
live in Georgia, I grew up in a hot climate, it's fine. Other parts of the world will be more of a problem. So you don't want to like say it's like.
Because Georgia will be like the Sahara.
Right, and look
So,
how
you know,
much
Georgia
Ironically,
will be up
North
here.
State should be
So you don't want to
more-
be too doom and gloom.
North
And
State
again,
should be
it is not too late to do stuff. If you look at the projections, if we act now, it's really around 2050, the curve will start to bend if we take action. And to be fair, people, like already, countries are taking actions. Things are better probably in that sense than they were 10 years ago. But it's not where it needs to be by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay.
And the real complication is those tipping points, because the curve looks like this, but you hit a tipping point, suddenly you do this, right? and we don't know where we're going to hit tipping points. That's why we have to take action really quickly to make sure we don't hit the tipping points. But I agree with you. There's actually been proposals, there may even one in New Jersey, to require climate change education as part of it. Although I think you're correct, a lot of young kids know about it. And so the real question is making it primary for people to take action. And I also agree, like I said, you have to make renewable electricity cheaper or easier to get. You have to make fossil fuel energy more expensive and hard to get. That's in the long run, that's the only solution because like the opt-up was available in Montclair, and you'd think for that low cost, there'd be a lot of people in Montclair would sign up. Very few.
Okay, one more
I think
question.
people don't know.
Yeah, people don't know. That's true. Okay, one more. So
One more question?
Are we good?
Anything, are we good?
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks for having me here.
Thank you. And we're gonna have you back
I know, I know.
to speak to more people.
That would be good.
And in that nourish.
Are these new?
No, the curtain.
Thank you
We're
so
welcome,
much for your
and we have a
time.
meeting next Sunday. We're still meeting on Zoom. So you're welcome to join us. Just
What
go
is
to-
it for the Montclair
Yeah,
Climate
Michael,
Action?
if you want to join, go to our website, just, there's like, go to our, it says, join us, there's a little button on the top of the page, you can sign up, we'll be happy to help.
Okay, but I will.
Thank you.
Thank you, thanks for having me, I appreciate it.
Oh, it's fine. Is there a comparable, organization in West Orange, or could be the
There is a group called Our Green West Orange.
Our Green
Our
West
Green
Orange?
West Orange, right.
Okay.
I'm not, they focus on a lot of environmental issues, not climate change. Climate change is part of it. They actually had a rally.
Good, that's my town.
Yeah, so, contact Our Green West Orange, they're pretty active in that.
Okay.
They've got a young high school student, she's like
She's
really
really into
active
it,
on climate
yeah.
change stuff. She's really,
Thank you very much. I don't know.
thank you. Thank you for, very good questions.
Thank you.
Very good questions.
I have a question for the
I'm glad that I don't know, as I said,
I'll ask you to.
You can't get anything wedding related. All bought. We have to find out. We have to find out what the job is.
okay, also oh, good, I'll do that, also. Oh, that's.
Oh, they can?
Well, they can get us the people.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
They know about.
They know about it.
Unless I need help, just let me know. So when I come here.
But they needed our curtains. It was too dark.
Yes.
Every single
Give us a
one.
hello.
Yesterday, he was like, oh, this looks so much better in here. So they're bigger now.
Plus, I think that there were people live streamed. I have to find out how many were there.
Thank you for
I
inviting me.
saw three.
Let me know what, you want anything else?
I would love to check.
Oh,
this
good.
out.
No, I'd love to stay connected.
And is there anything the congregation is doing?
We need to get
All
out.
things the congregation.
Yes, I think that.
Yes, we really need to. We don't recycle properly, I don't think, we use way too much plastic. Way
I
too
think
much
that we,
plastic.
so we should actually have a conversation with you, because we can start thinking about how to promote that. We're the social action chair, so I think this is something we want to tackle, so.
Definitely.
Okay.
I can see why it's hard to get people engaged. It's like so technical
Technical, yeah, hard to, yes, and distant, right, so like.
and distant and not upon us.
It really, you have to think about, like, to make sort of visualize what happened.
Who's it?
Like, I always think it was smart.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's there, what, 21, 18,
Yeah.
0, 18,
Yeah.
so that's, so I think what's coming up for them.
Yeah.
That's what keeps me.
Listen, thank you so much.
Thank you for, thank you, Jeremy, I appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think some things were on here, and at one point,
Yes, it's good.
I talked to Linda about it, there was an idea to be a little bit more green.
I think we need a committee.
But we need, yeah.
And we need a committee to have some policies developed.
Yeah.
You know, pricing what's called a tally light, you know?
I feel pretty strong, like, believe me, this is like not particularly interesting to me.
Like one of them there, one of the same.
Oh, when it
Lights
goes
up,
People
you're
know.
live, and it turns on.
Is this for the movie tonight?
Live from Shomrei, Emunah. It's the high holiday.
There you go. I'll have to have them pulled over. Like a skit.
Right. Yeah?
Yeah, I finally have a little time, because Larchmont, we just launched a new website, Larchmont, it's just killing me. Yeah.